What my case did was make it very clear that although you live in strata, you still have property rights. Just because a bylaw exists does not mean it's valid. Governance in strata changed, not just in regards to pets, in regards to the way people can conduct themselves in their homes. Should be no different to a freestanding property as long as you do not negatively impact another lot.
This is the Operational Clarity podcast, where we sit down with experienced leaders from the HOA, strata, and body corporate management industries from around the world to unpack what it really takes to build and run great operations. My name is Robert Hangu, and today we're joined by Joe Cooper from Sydney, Australia. Joe is a strata governance reform advocate, executive committee member at the Strata Council, founder of The Good Warrior, and the central figure behind the landmark legal case Cooper versus the owners, widely known as the Angus de Schnauzer case. She approaches community management from the perspective of governance failure, owner rights, and systemic dysfunction. She publicly questioned more than 500,000 Australian dollars spent fighting her pet ownership case without clear accountability to owners. She has recently released a book about that called Toppling Towers of Power, which is about her years-long dispute that led her to the Court of Appeal, where she delivered a landmark case that significantly changed strata law in the last 40 years. Joe, welcome to the show.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
How did building The Good Warrior change the way you think about leadership and community change?
I don't think The Good Warrior changed my perspective on any of that. It was born from those thoughts. I simply really got frustrated and a little tired of people dismissing the power of one and the power of our voices, and bystander inaction was really something that was problematic to me, because I've been in a few circumstances, let's say, where I witnessed ordinary people that have good intentions. So the majority are good, but their intentions are definitely clouded by fear or the notion that it's not their business to get involved. They are one person, they can't change anything. And so the Good Warrior was born to really challenge that thought process, to educate organisations and systems that create a culture of fear and not one that embraces people speaking up. Because I think silence has forever been the thorn to progress and growth.
Where do you think this fear comes from speaking up?
Persecution, punitive measures, relationships, loss of opportunity. Unfortunately, most people don't think it's worth speaking up. And what that does, it's a domino effect, because if everybody thinks that way, then throughout history, we would still be in, I don't know, the caveman era or something equivalent to that, because we can't sit back and think we don't have the power to change something, because every change throughout history has always started with one person pushing a boundary or standing up and saying, actually, you know what? This is unacceptable. This isn't right. I can't stand by this. We have this lack of belief in ourselves and people power that has always been the catalyst for change. And I'm not sure why people think that way when, history is our greatest teacher and tells us otherwise.
You've mentioned the fear of speaking up and the fear of consequences. Now, particularly in a strata scheme, what are the real consequences there, and why don't the homeowners speak up in that sense?
Oh, that is a layered question, because of the fact that I have been through it in such a toxic and targeted manner. And that is the reason I wrote Toppling Towers of Power. It is based on my own adventure, let's call it, of speaking up. I knew that the majority of people agreed with what I was doing. I knew that, because they were also very silent. There were a few things at play. People who had pets, for example, my case started as a pet case. It wasn't really about pets, but it did start about me questioning why we had a ban on pets when the building was full of pets. And that was all it took to start an avalanche of hate and toxicity and abuse. And so naturally, when others witness that outcome for simply asking a question, they retreat. Whereas I more jump in And how do I support you? How do I change this? I have learned that not everybody is like that. So over time, as I gained support, it was very slow. And some people never came out publicly to support me. There was, I don't want to be marked, so I don't want to be targeted for supporting you. So I'm not getting involved. Those who had pets were, I don't have an issue. The committee know I have a pet. Why are you rocking the boat? So they were annoyed that things were acceptable as they were. I shouldn't make a fuss. But for me, I didn't see this as a pet ban. I saw it as an obstruction to our property rights. Why should people be sneaking in, what is essentially a family member into their home that they've purchased? Another thing that really stood out and was quite disappointing was relationships. So although people agreed with what I was doing, the people they were friends with or had relationships with were not supporting me. So they felt they couldn't support me because of that. And then there was the opportunity. If I stand up against authority, what does that mean for me in the future? Because I wasn't only up against my strata committee, I had government officials who were also against what I was trying to do and stakeholders. So there's many layers as to why people don't speak up.
Would you say it's a governance issue, or is it more of an operational issue, as in there's no proper way to communicate, or maybe there's not an efficient way to communicate? Because you've mentioned that most people have good intentions. So where does this disconnect happen?
I see it as a cultural issue. So when you create a culture of fear, people don't know a safe way to speak up. So when there is a lack of trust in any community, it's not contained just to strata schemes. It's in organizations, it's in social settings, it's in family settings. If there is a culture of fear and the default is punitive, so if you speak up, if you ask a question, and the response is immediately a targeted campaign against you, people will retreat. And so the governance issue does come in to it, but it comes in later, because if the culture is toxic and there is no oversight body to correct that course, it's pretty dangerous. And it also allows the culture to continue to thrive in that toxic manner. So I think first it's a cultural issue and then it's a governance issue.
Yeah, these are deep topics. Can you walk us through how the case escalated?
Yeah. People really find it hard to grasp because, again, all I did was ask a question. However, if we think about any leadership team that has never really been held accountable, who doesn't have the emotional maturity to view a question or concern as something to discuss and grow from, you will automatically get a case where they believe they are being attacked. And that is what happened. I asked why we had pets, as I mentioned earlier, but on paper we have a pet ban. And the response was, if you want a pet, put it in a bag like everybody else and keep your mouth shut. That to me was not a sufficient grown up response, because as far as I was concerned, what that answer told me was we are now going to treat adults like misbehaved children and force them to smuggle a living being in a bag into their own home. Besides the other barriers that comes with, and I'll get into that deeper if we have time, that never sat right with me. And for that to be their response rather than, sure, maybe it's something we do need to sit down and have a look at and review, that would have been a lot more beneficial to everyone involved. Instead, when I didn't listen to that direction of just put your dog in a bag and be like everybody else, when I didn't take that advice and I continued pushing, then I became a target. And abuse started from people that I'd never met before. Gossip went around. You know how fast gossip gets around. People would swear at me and abuse me, and I had never met them. So I didn't know them. And then eventually they took me to NCAT, which is a tribunal here in Sydney. And we went to 3 major hearings, so 2 at NCAT and then the Supreme Court of Appeal. But in between all of those hearings, there were many little NCAT directions hearings around CCTV footage because I wanted evidence of my abuse. It was just a continuous jumping through hoops simply to get my property rights. And so when people hear that for the first time, they think that's really out of proportion. And it is, but it also isn't when you think about abuse of power. Those who don't want to be questioned will take the smallest, most innocent question as an attack rather than curiosity.
I understand. So for me to understand this a bit better, before this case, the building wouldn't allow pets, but everyone, or let's say pet owners, would still have their pets.
Correct.
Now,
Yeah.
I also assume that there are other buildings that allow pets, or is this, let's say, a statewide legislation that you're not allowed to have your pet? How was the exact setup in that way?
So there were too many schemes that had a pet ban. This was a major issue across the state and, to be honest, across the country. So pet issues, I think, were number two or number three for disputes within strata schemes. So it was a huge issue. Legislation had changed since, where are we now? Legislation's changed since, I'd say it's 15 years now, where it removed the blanket ban option, but it also allowed people to make their own bylaws without constraints. And that's what I was fighting. I wanted a limit on bylaw making powers, regardless of what the topic was. Because, what's stopping any scheme to rely on a majority rule? And when I say majority, I only mean the majority who turn up, not the majority of the building. They can make any law that they like, if it's within laws or not. And that should never have been the case. It should never have been accepted. But legislation was very, let's say, grey in that area. And so although legislation removed the pet ban option, it didn't replace it with you cannot ban pets. Does that make sense?
I see. So it was still at the discretion of the actual strata scheme whether they would allow it or not. So in a sense, even though the blanket pet ban was lifted, but it wasn't proactively, in a sense, it wasn't encouraged to allow them proactively. Is that correct?
So there was no real constraints on what committees or owners corporations could vote on. There was no limits whatsoever. And therefore that each individual scheme could vote on any topic as long as they had the majority of people in attendance vote in favor of it. And that's where the issue for me arose, because you can't give people broad powers over their homes. It's against our property rights.
And then once you won the case, what you gained and the change was that even a minority could propose new bylaws. Is that correct? So was that the change that happened?
No, the change was the change was the constraints of power on bylaw making. Let me say that again, actually. There were constraints around bylaw making powers beyond pets. So if a bylaw went against our property rights, even if the majority voted, it can be invalidated. Whereas before, it didn't matter if the bylaw that was voted on was against any law, schemes would continue with it unchallenged. What my case did very well was make it very clear that although you live in strata, you still have property rights, and just because a bylaw exists does not mean it's valid. That it made it very clear. And so governance in strata changed across the board, not just in regards to pets, in regards to the way people can conduct themselves in their homes should be no different to a freestanding property as long as you do not negatively impact another lot. Does that make sense?
Yeah, totally. What strikes me here is the fact that in other areas of the law, usually the governing law of the state or of the country always overrides anything that is written in any agreements that would contradict it. So you would always have the state law or the country's law be the highest law, right, in case of contradictions. And what strikes me here is that in the strata case, or in the case of strata governance, that wouldn't be the case. So you could have bylaws that could contradict the governing law and still be accepted.
Yes. The problem is I had to go to the highest court in the state. That should not be the case. It should not be a David and Goliath act to have laws enforced. And so that is my question throughout this entire journey. If the oversight bodies and tribunals can't get that ruling right, and every owner is forced to the highest court in their state or country, that is not an effective way to govern anything, really, not just housing. But it's not an effective way to govern, because people shouldn't be paying millions of dollars just for their property rights. There should be a clear very clear set of laws to protect you. And before my case, there wasn't. So my case changed 40 years of strata law in Australia. But it shouldn't have gone that far. It really shouldn't have.
Would you say there is too much friction in the strata governance system?
Yeah, there is. Put it bluntly, because we have people in positions of power with no qualifications. So when you think about it, what is a committee? They're a group of your neighbours. Anyone can be on the committee. You don't have to know how to govern. You don't even know how to project manage anything, let alone managing people. And when you're dealing with people's homes, I think you have to be of a certain personality and have a level of empathy to understand that when you are dealing with people's most precious place, that you have to have some level of understanding and tolerance to when they raise issues and concerns, and for the default not to be an attack. And so the friction comes with, as far as I'm concerned, lack of education, because the sad reality is people often take advantage of the power that they're given. And that's where it goes back to governance. Before my case, committee members were given broad powers to do as they like with no consequences. And that, I think, is the biggest problem. The problem now, although the Court of Appeal made it crystal clear the limits, unfortunately, committees are still pushing boundaries and doing really creative things to find more power. For example, after I won, one of the first things committee members did in different schemes was charge a fee to have a pet. So it was just another obstruction. I think the highest one I heard of was $2,000 an application to have a pet, although the Court of Appeal said it is within our rights. So I think it comes down to abuse of power.
What role do strata management companies play in this? Would you interface with the board directly, or would it be through a strata management company?
So I can only speak on my experience and the feedback and messages and emails that I receive weekly. We have a huge issue here when it comes to strata managers. So in my personal case, the strata manager overstepped his role. So whenever I emailed the strata manager, the committee were alerted each and every time. That was not necessary. When it came to footage, me trying to receive footage, they would be so obstructive that by the time I took the case to the tribunal and they granted me access to the footage, the strata manager would say, sorry, it's no longer available. At one point, before I think it was my very first motion, our strata manager was reaching out to people, offering to waive their fees and reinstate them after my motion was voted on, while simultaneously telling me that my proxy votes that were non-financial, sorry, I should have said it. So he was reaching out to people who were not financial, but telling people that were voting with me that their votes will not matter. So that's how involved our particular strata management company got themselves into the whole scenario, which, as far as I'm concerned, they are a service provider and they should have been advising our committee as to what the realities of the circumstances were, which they weren't. They were just telling our committee, from what I could see, what they wanted to hear. And they were also, as far as I'm concerned, part of the whole abuse of power.
How did the other homeowners inside the strata react to this? And did they even know what was happening at all times? Or
No.
were you in a way under the radar? Did they keep it in a way hidden? What was the Could you walk us through that?
Yeah, of course. So when I first tried to communicate with other owners, I sent a 2-page document as to the benefits, some research I had done around changing the bylaw. I asked if that email could be sent ahead of the first meeting. So at that point, I didn't ask for the emails of owners. I asked the strata manager if he could distribute this 2-page to go as a supporting document with my motion. That was declined. And that was the first obstruction of communication. Moving forward, I did ask for the strata roll. And in Australia, in New South Wales, if you ask for the strata roll, that includes the emails of the owners that have provided their email. That was also declined. So then I had to, do a letterbox drop. So I was putting these documents in letterboxes. I was reprimanded, and so was my neighbour who was helping me, both reprimanded for trying to communicate with other owners. So at every point, there was a great effort to silence me, to hide the documentation that I was trying to share. But the most damning came when I had won the first hearing. So there was 3, like I mentioned, hearings of significance. The first one I won and we overturned the pet ban. I got costs awarded in my favour. The committee then appealed on behalf of the owners. I submitted a quarter bank offer, and that offer was not shared with the owners, which I think was detrimental because I had offered to pay our own fees. So each side pay their own if they remove their appeal application, and that we sit down, because there was 2 quarter bank offers. Both of them were not shared. So I'm just going to cover both of them because I can't remember which sequence, to be honest. But over the 2 quarter bank offers, I offered to pay my own fees so they didn't have to pay me, that I would not challenge the bylaw until laws change. And if they allowed me to keep Angus after he passed, I would not get another pet. So that was a pretty generous offer, which I hated making, I'm not going to lie, but they rejected it and they didn't share it with owners. So owners never knew that. Instead, what happened after the first hearing, they raised more money from the owners to continue fighting me. And that happened all the way through. So there was constant surveillance of me. There was constant abuse from other owners towards me. I was getting things in my letterbox. I was getting spat at. I was verbally abused nearly every second day, multiple times a week. And it all came down to the fact that I asked a question, but nobody sat down to actually sit and talk to me rationally, no.
And was this from the other homeowner's side, or was it just from the committee's side? How did this abuse look like?
So I always reference it being the committee and their supporters. So it's about 30 to 40 people. Our building has around 500 residents. So again, that's why I always say, although the media and people who wrote about my case consistently referenced the majority, it was never the majority of the building. It was just the majority of those who participated. And that's enough in Strata, unfortunately. Not anymore.
So most homeowners would just go about their days as usual and they would never get involved with anything?
No, people were too scared. I got into a lift one day with a man in his 50s and he looked at me, he looked at Angus and he said, and he whispered, it was, really softly. He said, "Oh, you have my sympathies." And I turned around and I said, "I don't want your sympathy. I want your vote. Can you just sign a proxy for me?" And he said, "No, I don't want," his words were exactly, "I don't want to be marked." This was a man in his 50s. And I'm going to go further. This was a white man. I had somebody call me a stupid little brown girl. So I knew race and sex had a lot to do with the issues against me. And I was mortified. I'm thinking, he's a grown man who won't even give me a signed piece of paper. I didn't ask him to attend the meeting, but just sign the paper. So that is the level of fear. And that particular owner has now got a dog.
So it's the fear of the social pressure in a way, because at the end of the day, legally, either way, they would vote. Nothing would, let's say, substantial, or nothing would change their day to day. It's more about how they're being perceived by the other homeowners in the community, right? It's more about the fear of being judged, or in a sense, right?
Yeah. Fear of being judged, fear of not being included. So, a lot of people liked being part of the committee and that, they would have drinks every Sunday. They didn't want to be excluded from that. And as much as my brain understands the need to belong, I don't believe that it should override what you stand for. Does that make sense?
It does, definitely.
Yeah.
What has changed in particular in how your strata runs now after you've managed to overturn the pet ban?
In my particular apartment block?
Yes.
Unfortunately, not a lot. I still get abused. The culture hasn't changed. I am working really hard to try and communicate with the current chair. And I actually haven't said this before. I think it was a month ago. We had our very first meeting and it came after being abused in 1 week 3 times within, I think it was less than 48 hours. I'd been abused 3 times and I did email her communicating that something has to change. And we did have a conversation. And I'm hoping that something changes soon because it's been 11 years now. And I am very aware of the fact that a lot of people do want me to move out of the building. And so, no, nothing besides a lot more pets walking in and out openly, the culture itself hasn't changed. And that's why I say changing laws is one thing and it is powerful, but nothing is more powerful than changing the culture itself. And no law can really do that. It's up to the individuals.
What other changes have happened besides the pet ban? Because now this fundamental, I would say, structure of the law has changed, that if there is a clash between the bylaws and the governing law, still the governing law has priority. What other changes have happened? Not particularly in your building, but across the state. Are you aware of anything?
Yeah.
Has anything become public?
So across the state, there are now a lot of strata reforms, even in New South Wales. So what my case has done, and I am very proud of it, it has essentially placed strata in the spotlight, be it for the wrong reason, it doesn't matter. It has now put the way strata schemes are governed in the spotlight. So Victoria and Brisbane really changed their attitudes towards pet bans. There has been so many other cases around toasters in your kitchen, pools in schemes, laws around balconies and what you can do on your balcony. So my case has been cited 64 times in a very short span of time, and most of those cases are not pets. So it has really changed the way, I think, one, the way owners have now stepped up to claim their property rights and challenge them. And two, finally, a lot of tribunals, we still have some issues around this, but tribunals have now come to terms with the fact they cannot override our property laws. So committee members are getting some pushback on their, arbitrary management style. So it has changed. It's fundamentally changed the way strata is governed in Australia. And I do believe there is some global impact on policy as well.
How has your book been received?
Really well. It was very nerve-wracking to release this book because the book is about 20% of the story. I couldn't fit the entire story into one book. And so the challenge was the balance of helping people feel the journey without exhausting them. I also didn't want it to come across petty or revengeful. And so getting that balance was always heavy on my mind. And so far, I've received shock. People are shocked about what happened. I've had a few people reach out apologetic about what had happened. There has been a lot of people who now finally understand how quickly something can escalate when you don't have the right management system in place and oversight bodies. So it has thankfully been received the way I had hoped. So yeah, I'm very, very happy with how it's been received.
This is amazing. And it's definitely a story we haven't had on the podcast so far. We went very deep on some of the topics. Joe, it was amazing to have you here, to hear your story, to hear the changes that you brought along, and basically how you just kept going. I think not many strata owners would do that.
That has been the biggest feedback I've received, actually, is how did you keep going? But can I tell you one of my big drivers that I didn't share at the time? And I always say you've got to keep some things to yourself, because being underestimated in circumstances like this is actually really powerful. And when I speak, I say that often, embrace being underestimated, because the majority of people, not just in my building, but government officials and stakeholders, they never believed I could win, ever. And that was a real driver for me. But one of the biggest things that kept me going was, as a survivor of domestic violence, I was very aware at the issue around pets, violence, and housing. And one of the main obstructions, for example, is if I was in a violent relationship and I had a pet and I had a friend with some spare rooms, for example, he or she could not receive me as a guest and harbour me from a violent relationship because of a pet ban. And so one of the biggest things I'm extremely proud of is we have now opened up so many options for people fleeing violence with pets. And that was something that drove me every day. And a lot of people didn't understand it, but that is probably my greatest achievement in all of this.
So it had a significant knock-on effect that was much broader than initially, let's say, that initially thought, right?
Not that I initially thought of, no, because there was a few things that happened. There was a woman who was about 70 years old, and she approached me, and she had recently become a widow. And she said to me, I would love a pet for company. She had no children. And she said, I can't have a pet because I can't put a pet in my backpack. Safety. She's 70. She's not that mobile. And I thought to myself, this is insane that we have a loneliness issue in the world. We have the elderly who need companionship and, of course, the domestic violence. That was always in my mind. But the reason I always say victims of violence or people who have been in relationships that are controlling, psychological manipulation, not just the physical, we can see signs of abuse of power faster than most. So when people were saying to me, that's just policy, that's just the way it is, I just saw abuse of power. Because I had been through the gaslighting, I had been through Darvo, I had been through coercive control, I had been through surveillance. And the way I was treated, it was just a flashback to a violent relationship. And that was why I was probably the wrong person to do that to, because I wasn't going to ever accept it.
Interesting. Now, a closing question, looking ahead. What role do you see organizations like Strata Council playing in the future in the industry?
A huge one, a very human one. It has to now be about the cultures in our scheme. That is my biggest driver, because until this day, I receive emails from people, sadly, from women using their pension and their superannuation to fight their schemes. It's unacceptable. No one should accept that. And we shouldn't be living in a place where people being abused at home for disagreeing with one another as the norm. That should not be accepted by anybody. And so I hope that everything I do is eventually received as the human side of living in a shared community, regardless of where it is. We need to start communicating better. We need to have better leaders. And that's the role I see myself playing in everything I do with the Good Warrior, with Strata Council, with all of it. It's how do we bring back human conversation and understanding of one another to build better communities?
Those are some great closing words, Jo. Where can people find you online?
So thegoodwarrior.com.au, on LinkedIn. I'm very active on LinkedIn, although I haven't been the last week. Those are probably the two places I'm most active. They can also email me. My email is very public. It's jo@jocooper.com.au. So I look forward to hearing feedback from people, what they're experiencing, and hopefully with more conversation and more education, strata living becomes a lot more harmonious, let's say.
Let's hope it will. Jo, it was great to have you on the show. Thank you for participating and good luck with your endeavors.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a pleasure.